I think we're in the middle of a bioweapons war. That's what COVID was, and it goes way back in time, and that's what cancer is. I'm going to tell you, I think cancer is a bioweapon. It's a bioweaponized. It's not what people think it is, but it goes way back. But now we're in an information war, and information wars are tough because you don't know who to believe. And they know that fear and chaos are what have caused them to win for over 5,000 years.
Welcome to the War Room. I'm Kyle, and thank you for joining me once again on the Word of War. With the COVID outbreak and response in 2020, we witnessed a key turning point in spiritual warfare as the enemy used it to fracture communities, churches, friendships, and even families. But it highlighted a much more sinister darkness, one that resides at the heart of the modern industrial medical complex, a system that is not designed to promote wellness, but sickness and death. Joining me to talk about this today is the medical rebel, Dr. Lee Merritt. Dr. Merritt, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as things always go, it seems like on my show, we started off with some fun technical stuff. That is not the first time I've experienced this. I've found that some of the wackiest things that ever happen in the world happen before we hit record because the enemy does not like, more than likely, what we're going to talk about tonight. We prayed about that before we got going. So tell us a little bit about who you are, and for those that are not familiar with you, just a little bit about your upbringing and how you got into medicine, please.
Well, I come along from a long line of farmers dating back to the Revolutionary War. In fact, I thought about it. I'm the first person since that time not to grow up on a farm. But my father became a physician, so I got it in the blood. And so, I was in the Navy. I spent almost 12 years in the Navy, and the world is not what I thought it was. And yeah. I always thought wouldn't know. I'd be sad about retirement because you spend so much life doing a technical skills, like orthopedics. But actually, the one good thing about all this is it's kept me so busy I haven't missed orthopedics at all. But what I've really learned in this whole thing is how much we've been lied to in medicine, and it's not by accident. In fact, how there's a Sun Tzu art of war, and I've realized I can't find an equivalent art of biological warfare. I think I'm going to develop that. But the first rule is if proven science has been, or if science in general, if the scientific data out there that you could read and digest and think about is being systematically ignored, that's a program working in the background. And I would just say that I've gone way back and looked at that, and I found that for many things, they're wrong about so many things. It cannot be by accident. Even the blind hog gets the acorn once in a while. And the Institute of Medicine and our profound medical leaders just never seem to. And the other thing I discovered in this whole historical bent is that people say, well, if I don't see it in a peer-reviewed journal, I'm not going to believe it. Well, let me just tell you guys, the peer-reviewed journals are owned by the intelligence service. All of them that I can find. Except for the Journal of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons is not allowed to be in PubMed because they claim that we're substandard and we're not peer-reviewed. Well, we do have peer review, but the problem is that it doesn't meet their worldview. We would say things like maybe statins don't work or they're bad for you, but we would give both sides to the argument, and they don't do that. And I will just say that if people don't believe me, all they have to do is look up Pergamon Press, because after World War II, the two guys, there were, just after the war, apparently, Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin, and Charles Galton Darwin, Galton, the eugenicist, his uncle, and he's the grandson of Charles Darwin. They got together and they went to the British government and they said, we really think we needed better scientific publishing because we got kind of blindsided about what the Germans and Japanese were doing. And so we'd like to have better. And the British government said, no problem. They said, we can do that. We can get you better scientific publishing. How much do you want? And the reason they could say that is at that time, the biggest English publishing house for science and medicine, which was Butterworth's, it was owned by the British government, and not the whole British government. It was MI6. the spy agency, right? And then then when they because they'd won the war, they had German publishing houses, and they got with Springer, and they combined it, and they made it into the world's largest medical and scientific publishing house, multi-language and everything. And they hired as their first editor, not an editor, not a scientist. They hired Robert Maxwell. Now, Robert Maxwell, who's that? He worked for the British intelligence agency because he was fluent in German, and he was interviewing prisoners in Germany after the war. He was fluent in Russian. So we think he's probably a KGB agent. Pretty sure he'd have one-on-ones with Brezhnev. He's got to be a Mossad agent because he's buried on the Mount of Olives, and we know he's a CIA agent because his daughter is Ghislaine Maxwell, the pedophile consort of pedophile Jeffrey Epstein.
I was just typing that in to look it up. Pretty sure that was her dad.
We know that that's a CIA thing. So this guy's an uber spy. Why would you put that guy in charge of their biggest medical and scientific publishing house? Because we want to change belief about the world. We want to run a program against the population to convince them of things. And it's been very effective. In fact, it goes far before World War II. It goes, and at least, it's probably thousands of years, but at least it goes back to Edward Jenner and the smallpox vaccine. But it's been around for a long time that they've been waging war against humanity to keep us in balance. They're not too many, not too small. They want the number of people to be their definition, right? And this goes back to Plato's Republic. He actually says this in his book on marriage. So, yeah, it's a crazy world that I didn't expect.
Yeah. When did the train start coming off the tracks, or when did you start seeing the red flags that are like something's off here in your career? Well,
I will say that. So when I was in the Navy, I was a Navy surgeon, and you just did your job. And then when I got out and I was still in training, I did a spine fellowship. When I finally got into private practice and ran my own business was when in 1995, I'd been in private practice in Washington, D.C. And actually at that time, I got a little hint of it because I was on the NRAC, which was the Navy Research Advisory Committee. It was a subcommittee of Congress, and they looked at future technology for the naval services. And I didn't, what could I contribute to Kilo class submarine discussion? So I decided on my own to just kind of look at the bioweapons community. And, I found out some things that I kind of raised my eyebrows about, but that was, I compartmentalized that. Though as time went on, when I first got into private practice, I realized the financial scam of medicine. Not just for patients, but patients and doctors, everybody involved that wasn't part of the establishment. And then that was about 1995, 1996. And then when I really got, aware that we weren't doing medicine right was when I turned 50, and I felt like, suddenly I went from feeling like, King Kong to not feeling so good. And then I thought, well, I don't like getting this getting older stuff. So I went to the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine meetings, and I just started sitting there with my mouth open, because what I realized is they were quoting peer-reviewed literature and, their own experience and experimentation and things. And they were quoting this stuff that should have been read by the university guys and imparted in medical school. And in fact, it was just the opposite. And that continues to go on. I started seeing things that, wait a minute, we missed that, about the best ways to treat thyroid, all sorts of things. I just started realizing that we hadn't been doing a lot of things right. And I could see it in orthopedics, like the bone mineral density problem and how they were doing that. So I thought we kept making excuses for them. We'd say, oh, these government recommendations, it's just because they're government toadies and they don't really care that much. Or that doctor, he's just not very smart. Or he wasn't well read on this. It's a mistake, right? What we didn't really come out and say, though, was that this is a programmed long-term bioweapons program against us. That just didn't ring my chimes until COVID. But when you go back in time, you can now see I have a talk to show you the evidence of that, specifically when it comes to cancer. But it's not just about cancer. It's about a bunch of things. Do I have time to tell you a simple story?
Oh, please, by all means.
Okay, well, this is one of my favorite ones, and it's not something I learned from reading the Journal of Medicine or anything. This is something I learned from my own life experience and others. I was in my internship in 1980 and 1981. In fact, I was just giving a talk in Minnesota, and I said this. During my internship, which was at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, there were 2 of us interns on Tower 15. It was a terrible design for a hospital. It was built, it's this great big obelisk, and you run up, 15 flights of stairs. If they're coding your patient, by the time you get up there, they're coding you,
Yeah, it's over.
It's a horrible design. But there were 2 interns and a resident, and we took care of all the patients on that floor. But every month they would have a visiting senior staff member or doctor from out of the Navy, civilian would come in, or somebody from NIH in this case, and they would come and give us a little practical medicine talk, just the 4 of us. So there'd be the professor and the 3 of us. And one day I was there. This is just a little side vignette, but one day this guy comes in. He's from the NIH, but I had been up all the night before, and I can tell you, I don't fall asleep in meetings. I can count on one hand, 3 fingers actually, how many meetings I remember falling asleep in. But this was one of them. I'm sitting right next to this guy from the NIH, and I just found myself just asleep, and I woke up right in front of him, and in a room of 4, that's probably noticeable.
Yeah.
Anyway, that guy was Anthony Fauci. So I never, when he was just starting out, so I never expected to get a good job at the NIH. But
you didn't miss
about
much
that
from
time,
that little guy.
Yeah, about that time, I went to they let me do one meeting a year, and I went to a meeting on blood pressure. And it was a 3-day meeting. This was international experts on blood pressure. So this was the latest thing in 1980. And here's what they concluded at the end of that 3 days. They had a panel discussion. And even though I ended up going in, the reason I did a straight medicine internship, I thought I was going to be a cardiologist, but I ended up going to orthopedics. But I remember this like it was yesterday because it was so fundamentally interesting that they said this. They said three conclusions. One was, we don't exactly know at what level of blood pressure we should start treatment. We really don't know the very best treatment. We can't prove that this is the very best treatment. But the one thing we all agree upon is that low salt diet doesn't matter. Okay, now I want you to think about that, because what is this, 2025?
Yeah.
We are now 45 years later. And what are we doing? Giving everybody low salt diets. So I was speaking last year at Weston A. Price Foundation. In fact, I'm going to go again this year. It's in Salt Lake City. And there was a guy speaking, David Brownstein. Now, I knew who he was. I always used to think he was Dr. Iodine because he was big on iodine. But it turns out he's also Dr. Salt. He's really done some excellent research and work on salt. So, but when he explained this, I realized this could not be by accident. So he shows a slide so I go in and sat in his lecture, and he had a slide. And on the slide, it was a graph, and they compared cardiovascular death or major serious cardiovascular event versus salt intake. Because now we're talking about, remember, we're on low salt diets. And so on this graph, there's really one great big tall bar, and then there are a bunch of very short bars that are all about equal across the slide. And he said, guess which end is the low salt end? Well, it's the big bar of death. It's the big tall bar. And then when he explained it, it was so simple. This is like medical physiology, not even 101. This is not something those guys in Pharma could have missed. This is not something the Harvard boys could have missed. If you're going to treat blood pressure, this is basic. So what happens is, how do you have blood pressure? Well, you have to have fluid in your vascular tree, and you keep fluid in your vascular tree with sodium. Salt is sodium chloride and other salts, so you need a certain amount of sodium to keep your blood pressure up. Well, what happens if you are on an insufficient amount of sodium, like a low salt diet? Well, then your blood pressure starts to drift down as your vascular volume contracts, so the body needs more salt. If you're not taking it in orally, what it will do is it'll try and steal it from the cells. But it can only do that a little bit, because what happens is your cells need the sodium too. And what you end up giving yourself is what they call cankles. If you've seen, kind of older now that I'm of that generation, I shouldn't say old ladies, but these people that have these, kind of the ankles that hang over the edge of your shoes kind of thing, okay? The fluid in your ankles. So you'll start to get that, but it still won't bring your blood pressure up because you still don't have enough salt to keep that vascular volume going. So then your body turns on the emergency backup system. It's called the renin-angiotensin system. Angio meaning blood vessel, tensin meaning tension. So it squeezes your blood pressure, and it does it like a sledgehammer. It's not precise, and it'll overshoot. And then you've got high blood pressure. Now, let's just think about that. How could they have missed that? And to double down on it, one of the things Dr. Brownstein hadn't realized, and I interviewed him and I told him about this later. I said, the other thing they're pushing all over the internet is water. Oh, everybody needs to drink 8 glasses of water, free water every day. Really? And then what happens if you drink all this free water and you've got low salt? What's it going to do? It's going to flush out what little salt you have, and the problem is going to be worse. And you're going to go on more medication. So I'm sitting, my conspiratorial mind, I'm sitting now because I'm jaded now as I've gone through COVID and I've gone through all this stuff. I'm sitting in the back of the room and I'm thinking, those psychopaths in the smoky rooms of big pharma somewhere, they figured out, they said, how can we give everybody blood pressure problems and sell them a medicine and the doctors don't catch on? Well, I think this is what they did.
Wow.
That's just one of numerous ones.
You beat me to it, because that's what I was going to come back with, which is it's all over the place. I mean, all you need to do, it's insane to me that someone could watch television and see these ads and listen to the side effects of these medicines and not recognize what is being done to us, especially after what we went through in COVID.
Right.
It's
and
incredible.
I have to, in all fairness, I get that. And it's a psychological operation. And it's been, they've slowly conditioned us. Like they conditioned us for the COVID vaccine by using, if we can talk about that dangerous word, vaccine, they conditioned us about that by getting people used to walking in and getting the flu shot. And how do they convince you about flu? They started way back, the pandemic that wasn't of 1918. Okay. And they want you, they had masks, they had all sorts of stuff, but that wasn't, influenza has not been proven at all to be a virus. In fact, it can't be a virus. And the reason I say that is before the age of airplanes. Okay. And this actually comes from the Admiralty. I've become a crazy person. I'm now looking at deck logs of the Beagle to prove that Darwin wasn't even in the Galapagos. So I know how to use the British Admiralty logs. Anyway, it turns out that, in the days of sail, so-called, when there were wooden ships and iron men, they couldn't have possibly spread. When flu would break out, it would break out instantaneously around the world. Ships at sea would be out there with no sight of land, and they would get influenza at the same time somebody in Sydney, Australia got it. And all over the world. It would be eventually when the data caught up, it was all over the world, and it happened within a day or so that it all hit. How that can't be because somebody's breathing on somebody, a germ.
Mhm.
Okay, it just can't work that way. So what's going on? Well, it took another couple hundred years, and even most doctors don't get it now. There may be 5 of us. Dr. Furstenberg, Arthur Furstenberg, I'm sorry, deceased now, but he got it, and a few other people. But basically what's happening is it wasn't sorted out by medicine, it was sorted out by astronomy. Because it turns out that if you look at the pandemic seasons, it didn't used to happen. We never had a yearly flu season until we laid down the telegram lines. The yearly flu season, it was actually a decade flu season. So it would happen on 10 or 11 year cycles. So, a decade after it happened, and then maybe a decade later, or maybe it wouldn't happen for 2 or 3 decades later, but then it would happen. And those are the sunspot cycles. So it turns out it's basically an electromagnetic derangement. And H1N1, the pandemic, what was that? Was that 2000? I don't think it was 2009. I think it was 19. I can't remember the swine flu thing.
Yeah,
we
had swine flu. We had
Yeah,
avian
well,
flu.
it was the year that we all started carrying cell phones. Okay, especially in Europe. That started a little before we did. So these things happen at times. You can identify an electromagnetic perturbation, right? And people, your body can adapt to some change in the electromagnetic milieu, but it can't adapt quickly. And that's what brings us on. So this was well documented, like ships of sailors would just get sick all at once. And well, it was a sunspot cycle, and most of them survived it, but some didn't. That's just the way it is. And so that there's no evidence. In fact, in COVID, they tried to convince you this was airborne and contagious, but they wouldn't let anybody study it, really. Okay, the Chinese finally did. They told pathologists, you can't do pathology. What? That's the first thing you should do.
Right.
Infectious, an unknown disease killing people. But ironically, and here you can see the scam here. They wouldn't let pathologists do their job to tell you what was actually happening if they could figure it out. But they didn't, because they said, oh, you might spread it. But they didn't have a problem with morticians embalming those people. Okay,
Yeah.
really? It's crazy. But so in 1918, they actually did, apparently, even though we're seeing some of the same bloodline family players involved here, they actually did try to look in what this was. And so one of the things they did, for example, to see if they could, because nobody could figure out what was going on. So William Welch from Johns Hopkins, he was a pathologist, but he was suited up for World War I as an Army colonel, I think. And he was at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. And he and a team came down to Fort Riley, Kansas. Why they called it the Spanish flu, no one knows, because, well, I know it's a distraction. It makes you think it has some reality, but it really started at Fort Riley, Kansas. And these guys went down there and they did autopsies on the dead guys. And their comments were, we can't figure out what's killing them. It looks like bacterial pneumonia, but we'd never seen bacterial pneumonia act like this. Mm. And then 100 years later, some researchers looked at I think they were Chinese researchers. They pulled those pathology blocks that Welch and those guys had done. They looked at them again using modern techniques and modern stains and things and actually, I guess, genetic stuff. I don't remember all the things, but they said, we use modern virology techniques, if you want to believe in virology. And they said, we can't figure out what caused the death. It looks like bacterial pneumonia. Yeah. So nobody could figure it out. And they did this study. They took 108 so-called volunteers. They were actually Navy guys that were in the brig. And they got their sentence commuted. So maybe not quite so voluntary. But in any case, they were demographically the same as the people dying in the hospitals. And in Boston, which, by the way, if you look at a picture of Boston at that time, there are telegram lines everywhere. I mean, Boston was the quickest, biggest city to be just massively electrified or electromagnetic fields electrified, with telegram lines. So it kind of makes sense that would be the third biggest city hit with this problem. They go into the public health hospital and they get these volunteers and they tell them to do this. They said, look, we don't want you to touch anything. Do not touch anything in the hospital. But what we want you to do is we're going to assign you to a sick person that's dying of this disease. And when they breathe out, we want you to put their face right down there. When they breathe out, we want you to breathe in. 108 volunteers did that. 0 got infected. 0 got the disease. So then they said, well, okay. And then they swabbed the dying person's nose and oral pharynx, and they put it in that volunteers, and none of them got it. And the gutsiest thing they did was they actually took the nasal pharyngeal washings of these dying people. They made it into a slurry, and this is without the age of antibiotics, and they injected it into these guys, and nothing happened. Horses were getting sick back then, but they couldn't transfer it with a feed bag. You see, because it's an electromagnetic disease. That's what it is. The reason that they used to call it telegrapher's disease when they first laid down the telegram lines. The people that were getting sick were underneath the telegram lines. So the engineers, the brakemen, and the telegram operators. Anybody who was working along those lines in those buildings under the telegram lines were starting to get sick. And it didn't kill you, but it gave you a little cough. It seems to irritate the linings of your lung. It kind of, makes you a little jittery and you just don't feel good. People were not. There was actually a telegram operators walkout in, I think, Toronto, someplace in Canada, where they were upset because they wanted to, better working conditions, and this was one reason. Well, anyway, so that was called telegrapher's disease. And how did they fix it? And again, this is another bit of proof that it's actually electromagnetic. Is what they did was they just took a twist in the copper wire, and that broke up the coherent field. See, so that's just a little physics twist. They just took a twist. It broke up the field and the people were not as damaged.
Hmm.
So we are electromagnetic beings, and
Yeah.
that's what's going on here. And so given all that knowledge, and one more little factoid before I get to 1918. Whenever you try and talk about vaccines in the past, pre-COVID, and I realized about 2014 when they're mandating the flu vaccine that this wasn't good. I looked up the data when it was still available. They weren't hiding the data on the flu vaccine. I said, it doesn't work. If you really look at their own data, it was at the most, at the best, it could be 10% effective. Well, that doesn't make up for all the damage it was doing.
I got it one time in my life, and I got the flu.
Yeah, so you got
And I'm
toxic.
historically a person who does not get sick very often at all.
Right, exactly, because it's a toxin. And I'll tell you a little secret about that when I tell you about Edward Jenner. So the answer, every time you tried to deny any vaccines, they'd say, well, you believe it's smallpox and tetanus vaccine and, right? This and polio vaccine that they saved lives. And I used to think smallpox was legit, okay? But it's not. None of these are legit. And here's the story: Edward Jenner was actually funded by the government for his supposed discovery of smallpox and to put it out to the people. And it was being really pushed out, very much like vaccines are today, but not so much by big pharmaceutical companies as by the government. So it tells you what the big play here is. But here's the thing: this story. There's always a narrative. And the narrative is never the reality. So whether we're talking Charles Darwin, like I said, or somebody else, something else, I'm going back and finding these false scientists, including the science of virology, I think. Well, in the case of this, Edward Jenner didn't really discover it. Apparently, a couple farmers made this observation that these milkmaids didn't seem to be getting smallpox, and so he thought, well, they're probably getting a lesser form of this so-called virus or disease. It's probably cowpox is probably less damaging because they noticed that the milkmaids had pustules on their hands, but they weren't getting generalized smallpox. They weren't getting pustules all over them, these little vesicles that develop all over you. And the problem is, here's the problem, that if this story sounds so good that he then made this vaccine, and by the way, the crude vaccine, the way they did it back then, they just took the udders of these cows, these female cows. They had sores on their udders, these pustules on their udders. They expressed the pus, and then they would go and take your arm and they would make little cuts in it called scarification, and they'd rub the pus in because they didn't have injectable needles or any of that.
That's technically inoculation, right? Correct.
Yeah, it's technically, so that's an inoculation, but it's not what we think of as inoculation today. Yeah. But in any case, here's the little bomb in this whole narrative, and that is that bulls don't get cowpox, steers don't get cowpox, young baby heifers don't get cowpox. In other words, the only cows that get cowpox are those ones being milked by the dirty hands of the milkmaids. It was going the opposite direction. There is no cowpox. So when I finally read that and figured this out, I said, oh my gosh, what is going on here? So then I looked in the veterinary journal. I said, I wonder if they know the scam. And yes, they do. The veterinary books say they call it pseudo cowpox because they just can't bring themselves to talk about a made up disease. But we're still talking about influenza as if it's this virus that's spread from people to people. Now, because it's a great anti-human agenda. Other diseases are caused by toxins. They're not electromagnetic. There's a lot of poisoning going on. Virus in Latin means poison. It doesn't mean a germ. So if you and keep in mind that one of the first, in the Hippocratic Oath, written at the same time that Plato was writing the Republic and all that going on, and just shortly before Napoleon, or shortly around the time of the not Napoleon, of Alexander the Great. So poisoning was a favorite thing, especially of the big muckety-mucks like Alexander. He was a known poisoner. He would poison his rivals, and then he ultimately got poisoned. So poisoning people was a big thing. If you believe, however, that we make each other sick by breathing on each other, see, it's a great anti-human agenda. Ooh, I caught this disease from that guy. He was coughing on the plane. Instead of thinking, what poison toxin did I get into? What did I get into? Because if you start thinking you're being poisoned, then you're going to start looking for the poisoner. That's the bottom line here is they don't want you to look for the poisoner, so they're coming up with all these other excuses for why we get sick, and mostly it's they want you to believe we breathe on each other. I don't know if you know probably who he was the former vice president of Pfizer in Europe. He was the chief science officer, and he was a veterinarian and a Michael Yeadon.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, just had a brain fart there. But Michael Yeadon, and his PhD was in pulmonary diseases. So this is not a lightweight when it comes to knowing about diseases of the lung. And he just came out and said there is no evidence of airborne transmission of disease, period. Forget whether there are viruses or not. If people want to believe in these flying unicorns, go for it. But there's no transmission evidence. This is, little old me, the orthopod in my closet basement podcasting, they're not going to believe me. But we ought to listen to Michael Yeadon because if anybody should know, he should know. And he just said the truth.
Yeah.
He just said the truth.
Yeah,
Thank you,
it's
Michael
crazy
Yeadon.
to me because how I got started on this, and we're going to kind of, I want to hear about the 1918 in a second.
Yeah,
but
we'll get back to that.
how I started on this was actually during COVID, because I'm an '80s kid. I'm 47 years old, so I had my few little vaccines before I went to school, and we didn't have the raging autism and things that we have now.
Yeah, you didn't have that many.
No, I didn't, and it wasn't really, I think, until the '90s that things started to really skyrocket, if memory serves. But when we went through COVID, so I wasn't an anti-vax or any of that, but when we went through that, my wife and I, we went on our honeymoon. I started getting sick on the honeymoon. And my son, our youngest, was sick before we left. And then my oldest, I tested negative, which those tests are a joke anyway. But
yeah, they're totally meaningless.
Yeah, even the maker that, designed them said that you're not using them the way they're supposed to be used. But I came home. My wife started getting sick at the end of the trip. And our oldest was sick when he picked us up from the airport. I never tested positive. I got tested again because it just kept lingering. And then my wife tested positive and he tested positive and I never did. But here, we get through it, we recover. And then now all of a sudden we're being told that we still need to go get the vaccine. And I'm like, that makes zero sense. So I started doing my own research, right? And I started digging into everything. And I'm like, never in history have we ever mandated someone to go and get a vaccine when they have already recovered from what we're going to vaccinate them against. It makes no logical sense whatsoever from any scientific, perspective at all. And so that's when I started digging in and I started looking because I'm like, obviously I smell a rat here. And I started looking. Right, and that's what I found. I found this spider web is not even the word. This torrential web of just chaos that circles between all of the regulatory agencies and the drug companies and the collusion between the two and the complete and total conflict of interest. And as I started digging in there, I'm like, well, no wonder why this is happening. I mean, look at the rampant corruption because, you go work for the drug company for a little while and then you go hop over to a regulatory agency for a little while. Then you go hop back to a drug company. And it's like, we even had, I think it was heads of CDC or NIH. It was either head of CDC or another agency. I don't remember who it was, but when they didn't even proceed too far into the process of getting this person put on because the collusion was so bad. They were like, we need to kind of set you on the bench for a few years before we even try this because it's so obvious.
Oh, is that the one recently? There was one recently. I thought it was the CDC, but maybe
it's so bad that I can't even remember. But they eventually brought this person back. They waited their little time until things were less obvious, and then they brought him back. But anybody with two eyes to go look this up, could see it. It's like, for most of us that are not doctors, we had never heard of Moderna. We heard of Pfizer, obviously, heard of Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, some of the overseas stuff. But Moderna was not like a big name.
Well, because it was designed for this.
Okay, perfect. So this makes perfect sense. I'll finish my thought and then I want to hear about this because it's interesting to me. So here you have the head of Operation Warp Speed. I don't remember the guy's name. Forgive me for that. But when the Biden administration comes in and he leaves the government, who does he go work for? He goes to be on the board at Moderna. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. So
Right.
please expose the Moderna situation that you
Well,
just
I'm
alluded
not
to.
an expert on that point, but I'm just going to say that Moderna kind of came to life and came to we never heard of it either. And we're physicians. I mean, we knew
Okay.
about Johnson Johnson, Merck, all these
Yeah,
others,
right.
but Moderna just poofed out of the clouds
Yeah.
one day in 2020, you
Yeah.
know? And I was following this from the middle of December of 2019, really seriously, because I had a friend that had worked at Fort Detrick, our bioweapons lab, years ago, and I called him and I said, should I follow this one? Because in the past, SARS, MERS, he said, no, this is not going to be anything. But this one he told me to follow.
Yeah.
So I'd been following it for a while. But I'm going to say, in regard to that, I think that I think the pandemic of 1918 was like a trial run. It was the first attempt, maybe, because it has all the same players, even some of the same names and institutions. And it has there was a Gates involved, there's Johns Hopkins involved, the Rockefeller Institute was involved, we got the Army involved, and vaccines are involved. They're using masks. It's just, you can't, keep going, and it's all over. It
It's
keeps
like they pulled
going.
the playbook out of the
Yeah, it's a
out of the
playbook,
cabinet and
and
blew the dust off the top and just opened it to page one.
that's
And was
right.
like,
And here's the other one is, you have to have propaganda to deal with this too.
mhm.
And you know how we have these, it came out a couple, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, where they had all these talking heads that appeared to be independent small TV stations, but then they had them side by side and they were all
Yes.
speaking like a Greek chorus. Okay.
Yeah, it was like they
I
just were
thought that was
handed the
only
script.
I thought that was only possible in the digital age, but it turns out it was happening at the time of the pandemic. So I have a news archive to research the pandemic. The one thing I did not do is read any peer-reviewed published journal article on it, or any kind of, I actually had read those in the past, but I said, I know what they were going to tell me. It's
Avoid the
just
pollutant.
nonsense.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not right. So I went to what they call primary sources. I got the public health data from that trial in Boston. I went to the Navy archives. I went to the Kansas archives, and I got I paid money for a newspaper archive so that I could look at what they were saying over time, and I have my grandfather's diary that he kept from 1892 until he died
wow.
in the 60s.
That's cool.
And it was basically like a couple lines in there. That was it. No, I go around and I ask people, and when I give big group talks, sometimes I say, does anybody here have any family history? You were told this horrible tale about people dying in 1918, or even anybody of your family dying in 1918. And so far, zero. I can't find anybody. Now, I'm not saying there aren't some out there, but
Sure.
they're not the mass numbers we're told. So that's one of the things that happened over time. You can see that over time, what they told you was the death count in 1920 got bigger by 1940, and by 1960, it kept going up. So that now we think it's, 500,000 or 1 million people, or 2 million people, I think is the latest count. It's quite a bit more. That the most, it's probably something around 125,000, which it's more than the average, maybe year, but it's not, for pulmonary diseases in that time frame,
Yeah, it's
probably
not
not.
earth-shattering given the
But
population.
the real issue is what it was all about. And I will just say that, just like Putin used to complain in 2017, he started complaining that we were standing up all these bioweapons labs, not just in Ukraine, but in Georgia, in all these different old satellites, right? It was the Defense Threat Reduction Act. We bought them on a sound. And every time we would stand one up, these diseases would start coming out that they'd never seen before, like hantavirus and weird stuff. Well, in 1918, this whole thing first started the year before with the establishment of a military medical school in Kansas. And then they had an outbreak of typhoid fever, which is a little bit unusual in Kansas. Okay. So
Yeah,
they
a
had
little
this
bit.
outbreak. And so then they, but no, nothing to fear about, because we are the Rockefeller Institute and Johns Hopkins, and we have vaccine we've developed for this. So they show up with these crude vaccines, and they administer them to the Navy and Army people that are now in the base down there, and they tried to give them to school children, but the parents wouldn't let them in the public schools, wouldn't let them do it. However, they did force it on the Indian schools, the Native American population, because they don't want to have them around either. And so then what happened is, a few months after that, they came down with meningitis. Now, this is like the summer now of I keep saying 20, of 1918. So the summer of 1918, and in meningitis, naturally occurring meningitis, whatever we want to say it is, that we call viral meningitis, the biggest cluster I can find is 9 guys in San Francisco. Okay. It's usually one person or 2 people, and that's it. It's not like this is a lot of people. It's a bad disease, and people are afraid of it, but there's a lot of hype around it. So this meningitis, though, that hit 3 months after they vaccinated all the military with this typhoid fever vaccine, they all came down with 30% to 40%, depending if you were Army or Navy, came down with meningitis. That's not that's not meningitis. That's some kind of brain inflammation from toxicity of some sort. So anyway, but no problem. The Rockefeller Institute, who had hired, by the way, the son of Frederick Gates. Frederick Gates was the right-hand man of John Rockefeller and John D. Rockefeller, and he was a Baptist minister. Why he was the right-hand man is a little unclear to me, except Rockefeller was a Baptist. And interestingly, people should know, Rockefeller, he didn't use his own medicine. He did homeopathy. Okay. He didn't want us to. They shut down all those schools, but that's what they did for all the Standard Oil executives and him. But so they set up the institute, and Frederick Gates was the big cheese to do that. And his son was also Frederick Lamar Gates, I think his name was. He went to Johns Hopkins University, got his MD, and his first job was as a lieutenant in World War I. His lieutenant in the Army was to be a consultant at the Rockefeller Institute. Trust me, that's not the way it works. When you're an intern, when you come out of your medical school, you don't go to that. You go off with troops somewhere. I can tell you that for a fact. I went overseas with the Marines. So anyway, so that whole story is bogus. But anyway, he comes and he's the guy that takes the new meningitis vaccine from the Rockefeller Institute down, and now they vaccinate the same people. Like you said, here you just got over an illness. Isn't the time you should be vaccinating people?
Right.
And they always pick on the most vulnerable to vaccinate. People that have just recently been sick, they want to vaccinate everybody that goes in the hospital for flu and pneumonia and all that stuff. You're in the hospital for a reason. This shouldn't be getting just routine vaccines, even if you believe in them.
Yeah.
So anyway, they do that, and they came down to Kansas, and they vaccinated the troops again. And then 3 months after that, in November, was when the influenza started. And interestingly, and it was a big spike. I mean, it went up and it went down within almost a month and a half. It was not a long protracted thing, because it happens a specific time frame from the vaccine. Okay. Now, when you really look at what happened here, like I say, the pathologists couldn't figure it out. The doctors made several observations. One was that you would expect that the scrawny city kids would be the first to die, or first. That wasn't it. It was these big, tough farm boys from, Oklahoma and Iowa and Nebraska and places. The best looking, healthiest specimens among them were the first to go down. And why? Because they didn't have any electrification in those states. The kids from Boston, they had been slowly acclimated to it. So when they stepped into the electromagnetic field of the war preparation, because guess what they were doing down in Fort Riley, Kansas? They were teaching them to be telegram operators. You can't make this up.
Oh, wow.
So they have the telegraphic school down in Kansas. They start getting telegrapher's disease, which was well described at that point. So they should have known, just like our doctors should have known about some of this stuff. They go down, they start getting sick, and then they're vaccinated, and then they die. That's the chain of events. Now, there was a doctor, McBean. I'm blanking on her first name right now. She wrote a book, The Poison Needle, and she was like a teenager or a young person, a child, and she was a black family, and they were a religious family that were volunteering to help these. They and their whole congregation were volunteering to help these young men because they were so far away from home and they were dying and they had no one. So God love them. They went in because nobody knew at this time it wasn't highly contagious, and it's a guts baldness to risk your kids like she was. But the Eleanor McBean,
Yeah,
they go in.
had it pulled up. I was going to
Yeah,
pull that for you.
they just go in and they were taking care of these people. Now, years later, just by happenstance, she ends up being a doctor and she writes this book. But she points out, now she's an observer that later could think about this through a physician's eyes. She said, only the vaccinated died. Yes, as I said, Telegram's disease will make you sick, but it doesn't kill you.
Yeah.
They had to do something else to kill them, and that was the vaccine. So I really, and the masks, you see pictures of the 1918, everybody's in a mask. They quarantine colleges, they quarantine people. COVID was the 1918 pandemic redux. It was propaganda. And the papers, like I said, they expanded the numbers. So they're still using that as an excuse for doing those things today.
Yeah.
The pandemic of 1918. That's why you read the official things and you'll get this kind of pablum about what happened that isn't really true, but it makes a case for they claim that, they shut down Princeton or whatever, and that saved people. And there's just a lot of stuff, but it's not, it's smoke and mirrors.
Yeah. So before I get to my next question, if you guys are enjoying the show, please like, subscribe, follow, share. And if you feel I'm deserving of it, then please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to the show. Also, if you would like to be part of a healthy, healthy, supportive, non-algorithmically controlled community of believers, I would love for you to join my school community. So click on the link above, or you can check the description for the link to join today. So I want to fast forward to 2020 to our pandemic, scamdemic, Vaccination, whatever we want to call it. I think I just rattled off enough there to cover both of us, right? So there we go.
Yeah.
And then, you get into this time and obviously you come out of this labeled the medical rebel. So share your story there as to what started happening to you through that whole time frame.
Well, it's actually kind of a funny story. I mean, I knew something wasn't right. I knew that, first of all, we knew that masks didn't. Once they figured out that they thought it was a virus, even believing in viruses at that time, not having looked at some of the facts that I believe now, that we knew that masks didn't work for that. That's why I ended up and in favor of that is anybody, and any doctor should know this. Every one of those psychopaths that went along with the masks should have recognized this, because when they were third-year medical students, they did a rotation in surgery. I think it's a mandatory rotation. And what happens is when you're in surgery, they teach you, if you're going to sneeze or cough, your tendency is you want to turn away from the table, right? You're holding this retractor. You can't move your hand, but you can turn your head and you can turn your body a little bit. And that's your tendency. But they tell you not to do that because you'll blow it out the side of your mask onto the wound. You're better off if you just blow it out to your neighbor surgeon next door. So we knew that they didn't work. They weren't there for that reason. People say, well, you're a surgeon, you wear a mask. Yeah, I wore a mask so I didn't drool into the wound. And so if I got splashed with blood when we're doing a lot of spraying of cleaning stuff, we don't get it in the face and our eyes and things like that. So that's what masks are for.
It's more to protect you, it sounds like, as the surgeon versus the patient.
Right. And even the N95 masks that then came on. So when this came about, I started doing some up-to-date reading of the literature now about masks. I'd just been taught about them before. Now I'm going to research. And I discovered, it's not like OSHA just poof was not there. That environmental services research has just never happened. We had this research for decades. And in fact, during the course of early COVID, the CDC's own magazine, Infectious Diseases, did a study on, I think it was influenza, but it might have been, it's someone viral. I think it was influenza. And they looked at three things. Does spraying your environment and cleaning your environment with these toxic microbial agents, or wearing gloves or wearing a mask, did it matter to the transmission? And they looked in caregivers and people going into houses of people that had what they thought were influenza or like diseases, and it didn't. And that came out during COVID.
Yeah.
Okay. But he never heard that because it would blow their narrative. So anyway, I had a little office in Omaha, Nebraska, and Ben Tapper, I don't know if you know him, but he's a chiropractor who's been speaking out. He got smart. He's a young guy, but he got smarter quicker than I did. So he'd been speaking out against vaccines and a lot of things. I caught on to all that in about 2014 when they were pushing the flu vaccine, and I looked at the data. But I did, he'd been doing it for a long time. So he calls me up one day, and I didn't really know him, but he calls me up and he said, "Hey, Doc, would you help us defeat the mask mandate they're trying to bring in Omaha?" And I said, "Sure, Ben, what do we have to do?" And he says, "Well, just come down. We're going to speak at the city council meeting." I said, "Sure. How long do we have?" 3 minutes. I said, "Shouldn't be a problem. Nobody believes in masks for this at this point." Well, that was wrong. The entire University of Nebraska was sitting on the other side, the chief of ID, the chief of medicine, all these bigwigs. And they're just, and I mean, this one guy said there are 10,000 studies that show that masks work for this. No, there aren't. It's just not true. So the fix was it. I mean, that I realized that, and I was so disgusted by the time I got up there to speak, and I was working that day, so I came in my scrubs. I'm standing there at the podium, so it's kind of a good photo op, and when I got to the end of my 3 minutes, I turned to those guys and I said, "Anybody that believes in masks for this at this point is either being paid or being played." Now, that would turn out to be very prescient. I didn't realize how seriously that was true, but in any case, the pay fix was it and many other things. So I said that, and then it got picked up by Alex Jones. And that somebody was videoing it. It got picked up by Alex Jones, and I'm driving home from work one day, and I'm just turning on the radio trying to find. And here's Alex Jones. Here's me talking on the radio. I'm saying, "What is that?" And it's the Alex Jones show. So that was how I got started. And
boom goes the dynamite from that point. I assume.
And then AFLDS, that was the big one, and that really woke me up to how controlled. I knew the press was controlled, but did you have the idea they were this controlled? I mean, it's unbelievable.
Honestly, the two events that I can point to in my lifetime that showed me just how controlled everything has been, and it's almost like, I've been using the term here recently, is the unveiling of evil.
Yeah.
Was COVID. And then the other one just happened the other day with Charlie Kirk. I think what happened there, and I'm not going to get into that whole thing just because we're not having that discussion, but what matters to this and why I say that is because what happened is you had evil it showed its hand.
Yeah.
It wasn't so veiled anymore.
Yeah.
It was like we pulled the covers back and people could see for what it was.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people that had their head in the sand the other day when Charlie Kirk got shot watched how gleeful everyone was. And I think what they drew from that was, well, if you're that happy about him, then you would be that happy about me. And I think that was a pretty big shock moment for everybody, a big, huge splash of cold water in the face.
If you hadn't been shocked by them threatening Trump to be decapitated and things like that.
Right.
Yeah,
but until we got to COVID, to answer your question, no, I did not know it was that bad.
Yeah, no, I think COVID, no matter how bad you thought it was when we got to COVID, it looked worse. I think
worse.
That's true. Way worse.
Yeah.
I mean, like Scott Kesserson said to me today, because I said, okay, we have these talks, and I said, Bards FM, I said, "Scott, okay, I'm going to tell you something, and you're just going to think that I've gone off the deep end. I'm loony." And he said, "Listen, the way the world is right now, if you told me you lived in a tuna can, I would believe you."
You'd be better off in the tuna can, I think.
Crazy, but it's because, and this is, I'm hopefully going to get this book out soon. We actually do live, and mine's about the medical matrix, but we live in a false reality. I mean, this is really, we are living in a false reality. You wouldn't have virology unless you had computers, because there is no virus genome ever been found in the wild in total. And that's one absurdity. So, I mean, this is like, without this artificial overlay, the way I kind of look at it is, when they say this world is Satan's, that's the overlay. God's world is the real deal. When I go out in the garden and I'm gardening and I can see things grow and I, chase my cats around or chickens or whatever, that's the real world.
Amen.
And talking to somebody in person is the real world. Now, everybody needs to keep in mind, when you're trying to dissect what happened by film, that's the artificial world. It's not even film like we used to take with a camera. This is digitized
Yeah.
world. So this is the world of make-believe, and they can do whatever they want with it. And that's what they've been doing. And it's not just in medicine, it's not just in politics, it's in physics, it's in everything. And my point is, like I said, I decided to go back and look at the scientists. How did we come to these conclusions that there are these things like viruses? And I find out it's all the same families. They're all bloodline. It's related. It's like, Charles Darwin had married his first cousin. They all marry their first cousins. They used to marry their sisters. And then here's one I found out. Plato. Okay. This is 400 BC. Plato's writing the Republic, and the Republic is about, Socrates. They call it Socratic dialogues because it's Socrates talking to his student. And so this is there's multiple books, but book 5 is on marriage. And I don't remember how I decided to look at this, but book 5 on marriage talks about what he now thinks about as the optimum marriage. And he goes in, his student's name is Glaucon, and he says, now, on marriage, he said, let's just think about that. Look at your look at your household here. You've got fine horses, and you've got fine hunting dogs and hunting birds and things like that. Don't you breed them? And he said, well, yes, of course. He said, exactly, because if you don't breed them, they're going to get weaker, and you might get some bad ones and things like that. Well, why aren't we doing that with marriage? Why should we let people with, really good bloodlines marry people that are inferior? So he starts having this discussion. And then in the course of this, as he's going back and forth, and he says, now, this does mean that in the future, doctors are going to have to be made of sterner stuff. And at this point, Glaucon says, why? Why? And Plato says, Socrates says, well, of course, if the doctor just gives you diet prescriptions, he doesn't need to be very good. But if he's going to give medicines, then he's got to be top notch, and he's got to have, he's got to be tough, because your government's going to have to lie to the people. They're going to have to lie so that there's not a revolution. But we know that we're going to have to use medicines in the future to control the population. I'm paraphrasing it from kind of the archaic language, but that is exactly what he said.
Wow.
That we are going to have to use medicines to keep the state from becoming too big or too small.
Well,
now.
It makes a ton of sense from a biblical perspective, too, if you really think about it, because you go all the way back to Genesis, and one of the things I talk about on my show, obviously the whole show is about spiritual warfare, everything we've talked about today. While we've talked the surface level of playing out in the world stage, right, ultimately the underpinning is spiritual warfare, right?
Absolutely.
And we go back to Genesis 3:15, and you can see the seed war begins there. And so it makes a ton of sense when you think about it from a lineage perspective of what you just said, where in order to combat against God, if they maintain this purebred and pure blood tact, and tactic and track, then they can fight against the decay that is slowly happening over time. I guess that's one of the things I just thought of as you were saying that. So it makes perfect sense.
But he's really described eugenics.
Yeah,
and
that's exactly what I was going to.
If you look at the elite of the world, they're all eugenicists.
Yeah.
And they always have been. You've got certain black nobility that are running the whole Planned Parenthood and all that stuff. They've got some people do this, some people do that. It's like the Rockefellers, Carnegie's, Ford Foundation. What was the other one? Maybe that's the Vanderbilts. I can't remember, but there were 4 family non-taxable foundations that were investigated in the 50s. This is J. Edward Griffin reports this, but it was investigated in the 50s. It was called the Reese Commission. And they were looking at what has into these, because they were getting by with paying no taxes. They were tax-free. What are they doing with all this money? And they found out that there was very good evidence that this consortium of big foundations had been behind World War I. And that they found a telegram by one of them to Woodrow Wilson, threatening him that he had to keep the war going because they hadn't made enough of a societal change. Essentially, it's about bringing about the one world order, the one world government, whatever you want to call it, and that they thought war was the best thing to change civilizations. But it really didn't have the effect on the Americans that they thought it would. More on the British, less on us. So they wanted to prolong the war, but that didn't happen. So then they had to do some. Then they decided we're going, and they had this. They found this in their documents. They had letters back and forth. Then they decided we have to take over the State Department and we have to take over education. And then that is what caused and then they gave the Rockefeller boys the job of taking over education. And by the way, I'm not suicidal. Okay. After I'm saying all this, I'm not at all suicidal. I'm very happily married. I have a nice life. I'm not, and he's armed, so don't.
Yeah, there you go. And at the end of the day, they got bigger fish to fry than I think either of us. So, and let them fry the bigger fish by all means. Go for it. Yeah, the other thing that I've heard you say before too, and I couldn't agree more, was not only are they eugenicists, but they're Satanists.
Oh yeah, the meme about I just found out I'm paying taxes to pedophiles.
Yeah,
yeah, it's true. I'm sorry,
true. And unfortunately been true for a long, long time.
Oh yeah, it's been true since So I have I think it's a 3-part series on It's Time to Name the Enemy. All roads lead to Phrygia. That's the punchline, but it actually leads to Babylon and maybe back to old Sumer, but that's lost in the dust of time. So I couldn't go back beyond that. But there's, I have to assume some things to get from Babylon to Phrygia. But once you get to Phrygia, they started corporations. They practiced the old religion, which we call Satanism, but they called the old religion, and they worshipped Cybele, which was a bigendered goddess, that was the queen of all, and you remember
Ishtar.
And to remember, think about if you really know what's going on symbolically, then you know what they're telling you. So remember when who married Ted Turner, Jane Fonda?
Yeah.
Okay, remember when Jane Fonda did this creepy, I never went to see it, wouldn't want to, but she did the vagina monologues.
Yeah.
It was a play on Broadway. And I thought, okay, she's really gone over the top here. She's really lost it. But that was an homage to Cybele. It turns out, as they keep studying that religion, why that religion is from 5000 BC, essentially. They predated the Egyptians. I'd be curious, you're a lot younger than I am. I'd be curious to know in school if you were ever taught that the Egyptians were not the oldest really documented civilization. We were taught it was all about pharaohs and the Egyptian, but they never talk about it's kind of like you never hear the families that are really involved in stuff.
I think by the time by the time I came along, I think now and even during my time, it was all about the Samaritans.
Really?
Now
okay, so they are talking about the
Samaritans.
Sumerians. Well, that's interesting. But I tell you where it really, so the Babylonian system, we can prove that the Babylonian law system is the basis, literally almost word for word, of our legalese, not of common law, but legalese. I have a copy of a translation from 1905 on my desk, just in case I have to check something. So that's really fair. But what happened is there's not a lot of things going on that I can find that they did with all that until it went to Phrygia, and this country that was now it's in ancient Turkey. Remember, I talked about the how intelligence services owned all the publication.
Yeah.
Well, he named it Pergamon Press, and this is actually what got me started on this whole deep dive. Because what's Pergamon? What's that got to mean?
Revelation.
Well, that's right. And I didn't know that. I'm not a biblical scholar, but a friend of mine is. And he said, wait a minute, Pergamon. Oh, wait a minute. That's the book of Revelation. That was the seat of Satan. So I started looking up Pergamon. Well, guess what? Not only, this was in Phrygia. It was in the Phrygian Empire. It was on the southwest, southwest area of Turkey now. But the Phrygian Empire was pretty big. And in this area, this was where they did human sacrifice and lots of other stuff, but that's why it was called the seat of Satan. This temple to Moloch or whatever, that temple collapsed and was buried in the dirt and everything. And in the 1800s, the Germans came down and they unearthed this sacrificial altar and the temple that was in the temple at Pergamon, and they took it back to Berlin and they reconstructed it. It's sitting in the Berlin Museum today. And if you go and look at that, number one, this is why it's important that you read Symbolism, and this isn't even the most important symbol probably, but is that building became what Albert Speer used in World War II as the backdrop to Hitler's speeches. That building that you saw at Nuremberg, if you look, it has these old ionic columns and things. And think, I didn't catch that at first. It was just a big white building, but that's what it was. So it was, and where he stood was where the brass bull was on the temple. And then in 2008, and I'm not making a political point here. I'm just making a historical point. When Barack Obama accepted the nomination to run for president, that weird backdrop, I remember that weird backdrop, and I was sitting with my girlfriend from San Diego, and we're talking, and I said, what is that blue, weird Romanesque backdrop about? It's kind of strange. That's a reproduction of the Phrygian altar, and if you look at it and put them side by side, you can see it. It's really, and he had been to Berlin and visited that museum before the ceremony. So I'm telling you can't make this up.
No, I see stuff too. And it's the other thing too, is you kind of had mentioned a little illusion. Your book, it sounds like, you're even kind of using parallels to the Matrix. That's really what it's like for those of us that kind of have had the awakening, the remnant, if you will. You see it all the time now. I can't not see it.
You can't not see it.
And it's all over the place. And the thing that I'm finding goes back to what I said earlier, is it's becoming less and less covert and more overt every day. It's like right in everybody's face, because it's like for the vast majority, I feel like, of the populace, they are so numb and dull and just have been so lulled to sleep that they don't see it, and they don't even they're not trained enough, because the church has become so weakened. The denominational churches have become so weakened that they don't teach it.
Yeah.
So when you don't know what you're looking for, how are you ever going to see it, right? You don't know what you don't know. But then they've been lulled to sleep with exactly what the Romans did. It's like, give them food and give them death, and everybody's going to be happy, right? Have their football on Sunday and numb them out in their brains.
Well, and I think there's another point, is that we grew up, Christianity, as it has been, in my experience, taught, it's kind of, it makes evil and evil, like they make, we have all these joking movies in the past that now they're not so joking, but when I was growing up, when you saw the devil, it was always like a cartoonish kind of guy, right? It was a joke. And even in church, it was like, Satan was kind of like a metaphor. Now, I'm not saying that was true in all churches, but I think there's a lot of part of Christianity that really, they treat it like a metaphor. Because if they convince you, that's why we made, some people, not me, I didn't know much, but they made fun of the Exorcist, basically, as if that's all just made up, and there's no such thing as demons, and there's no such thing as it. And when you realize that's not a fair representation of what's going on here, and it's very personal. And I'm worried. For example, I've noticed. So there's in this coming out thing that you mentioned about. My observation is, the idea that they have to reveal what they're going to do to us, even if it's in a creepy language, like calling. So a virus is a perfect example. When they said a virus is spreading around Wuhan and it's killing people, they didn't lie. They just were speaking Latin. So they were telling you a poison has been spread around Wuhan and it's killing people. And I think that that's part of it. But there's also this idea that there's something about, I think they're actually doing things. Well, like I was at a Bars Fest, and I've been at several events where they actually were threatened by like covens of witches and things. You can't believe this. It's really kind of shocking, but I worry about a lot of the subliminal messaging on watching movies. I want to, now I don't have time to watch. I shouldn't be watching movies and TV, but there's so much out there that is so true that they're telling us on these shows, that some of these shows I just got to watch to see what's going on. But then you'll get to a part where they're chanting, or there's a thumping, and I just cover my ears. I don't want to hear it. I think that they know how to manipulate us. This isn't just about what they're saying, it's how they're saying it. It's what they know about rhythms and chanting, and they know about
Frequency.
the occult. It's just hidden. Occult just means hidden.
That's right.
Doesn't mean not true. It just
Mhm.
means hidden.
Yeah, they're masters of frequency, right? This is the thing that we don't
Yeah, they are.
understand, and I had a great conversation with a dear friend of mine, Dr. Joy Pugh, actually, and that's who I'm going to recommend at the end of the show. I always recommend another show for folks to watch if they like this one. And we had a couple conversations. She has a book out called Beast Mark, and really she gets into the pineal gland and how the frequency basically can kind of crack and hack your pineal gland.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because, one of the things too is another place on earth that is very strange and there is so much demonic and evil activity is Switzerland.
Well, I think that's the head of the I think there's at least of the intelligence services.
It seems to be.
I think that that's the Octagon
Mhm.
group. In fact, I'm sitting here somewhere. Here it is. I've got the it's the cult of Baal, and it has all these different. It's that the Deep State Mapping Project.com, and he has these big posters you can get. And this was the cult of Baal. And when you go down, it goes down the Canaanites and Hyksos, and then the Vatican, and then you get to Switzerland, 1291, and black nobility, Merovingians. Yeah, all of our presidents up through George Bush Jr. were Merovingians, meaning they descended from Clovis to Charlemagne. And then down there, the Bavarian Illuminati, people think that's a joke. No,
Yeah.
that's not a joke. And that's what President Washington, when they see, they're trying to, that's another thing, is all this symbolism in DC, all this stuff, they're trying to, they hate George Washington. Anytime that I might say, what is Trump thinking? Is he really a good guy? What's going on? I always remind myself there are three people they hate to the ends of the earth. One is Putin, because he represents the old Russian Empire. The second one, and he took down the remnants of the Bolsheviks, which were these guys, okay?
Mhm.
And then the other one is Trump, and he's not bloodline. As far as I've got old, the Burke's Peerage and all that kind of stuff I've looked at. And then the third one was George Washington, because he was nobility, he was a Merovingian, and he turned on them. And he warned about them. We have his letters about warning about the Illuminati. We were taught and I forgot the history much, but about him getting back into uniform after he retired from the presidency to fight the Whiskey Rebellion, right? But it wasn't really about whiskey. It was about I think it was in Pennsylvania. It was about the Masonic lodges becoming Illuminized, meaning they were being taken over by the Illuminati. So the Masons didn't start out that way.
Yeah.
They've just been taken over by these guys.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's so much history that has been so carefully covered up. That when you start digging in there, and it's like, where does it's hard to find the bottom of the rabbit hole sometimes. And it's almost like you need to have somebody holding your feet so you don't fall too far in and lose yourself, right? So it's kind of crazy. But I want to ask you about your faith, but just before I do, if you guys are enjoying the show, please do like, subscribe, follow, share. If you feel like I'm deserving of it, then please do leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to the show. And again, I cannot stress this enough, man. If the last 2 weeks have proven anything, we need some good community as far as in the family. So if you would like to be part of a healthy, supportive, non-algorithmically controlled, and if I can't stress that enough, non-algorithmically controlled, everybody has gotten a nice flavor of what algorithmic control looks like over the last 2 weeks. Please do join my school community. So you can click on the link above, or you can actually check the description and get everything you need to join today. So when, for you on your faith journey, was this something that you just kind of grew up and you were there all your life, or was there kind of a point for you?
Oh no, I came from an agnostic family. But, I grew up in small town Midwest, and if you didn't go to church, they made
You
fun of
heathen?
you, and it was kind of like, ugh, who are you,
Yeah.
So my neighbor, I went to church with her and went to Bible school, and from the time I was a little kid, and I was I got myself baptized, and I would say I was a devout believer. But then, like so many people that go off to college and they go and they study at liberal arts colleges, and they start studying science, and it's all being taught in a certain way, as you know.
Yeah.
You kind of drift away.
Yeah.
And I never became anti-Christian, and I never became an atheist. I always believed in God. I always believed that I didn't understand the whole system, but that there was a Christian ethic that was good, and there was God, and I never got away from that. But the reality, like I said, I saw a lot as metaphor, because that's kind of the way some of it was taught. Not Christ, but the bad side. And it's kind of a weird thing that goes on when you go to college. But anyway, and I would say that in fact, like one of my surgeon friends years ago said, "You're the most Christian person I know that doesn't have a personal relationship with Christ." That was his comment to me, that I
Oh,
should be
wow.
going to church and doing things. Okay, years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, so I think I tried to emulate or live that way. I just didn't go to church, and I unfortunately didn't teach my kids. I was just like my parents. They didn't
Yeah.
teach me Christianity, and I didn't teach it to my kids, which I regret now. I didn't take them to church. But what happened is, I'm not kidding you, and this is really not just me. This is a lot of doctors. I was in the surgeon's lounge. Now, the surgeons are a little different than the general medical. We have more psychopaths in the surgeon's lounge than they do in the general medical thing per capita.
That's comforting.
But we're also we always are sitting in there. Maybe it's just because you were in the surgeon's lounge together so many hours that you're always debating things and
Yeah,
thinking
right.
about things, and so that my son, who's now a surgeon. One time I told him, he was like 10 years old or something. I said, "Say, why don't you come with me, and you can hang out in the surgeon's lounge when I go make rounds, or you can go out and make rounds with me." He says, "Mom, I know what happens there. You sit around in pajamas, people drink coffee, you watch the stock market and make bad jokes." I said, out of the mouth of babes.
There
He
you
just
go.
described the surgeon's lounge. But anyway, when COVID hit, and we started seeing all this stuff happen, and I didn't initiate this conversation, but I'm going to tell you, I've had more doctors say, "I just started reading Revelation." Yeah, me too. Yeah, me too. And that was exactly me. I said, "What is going on here?" Because it just didn't make sense, and we couldn't make sense out of it.
Yep.
And I will say, just at the end of this point, I will just say that if you had done no listening to the pundits and no watching TV, you would have learned more from just reading Revelation, and in fact the New Testament, and maybe some of the Old Testament, than you would have
Yep.
by anything they told you from the CDC, FDA, or any of those guys.
Yeah,
So,
you're absolutely right. That was kind of my journey too.
whatever it is, it's true.
It's yeah, you're
it's
dead
got
on
truth.
right. That's kind of how my faith really started to get a big boost. Was I had met my wife. We've been dating for a while, been married, and we really started to grow because it was the first time in both of our lives that together we had a non-combatant on the other side that was willing to actually be a partner in our faith. And when we hit COVID, it was just you could see the evil. It was like you could
Right.
when it got unveiled, it was like you could see it, and it's like, am I seeing what I'm seeing here? And one of the tactics that was really tried was to make us feel like we were alone, right? Like,
Exactly.
look what they did to you, right? But they did that to everybody, but especially you guys on the medical community. If you dared to speak against what did I call it earlier? The medical industrial complex. We talked
Yeah,
about the military
term. I like
industrial
that, too.
complex, but medical industrial complex, then you're going to be destroyed, career-wise. But we started gathering together in a small group, and we did a Constitution study, actually,
Nice.
to see what the Constitution said, but we did it through a biblical lens, biblical Constitution study. And then it just turned into an organic small group, and we just kept meeting. And what we found out is we weren't alone.
Yeah.
And then, but through that whole process, like when I started digging in, my faith just took off. And for the first time, in my life, I was finally useful to God. That's the only way I can put it.
That's probably not true, I'm suspecting, but that's a good point. I mean, I think, in fact, I didn't really know what apocalypse meant.
Mhm.
I had never really thought about it. Like, how many people knew pharmakia, that the Bible was translated,
Yep.
and pharmakia really was originally, it's sorcery.
Always
in
coupled with sorcery in the Bible. Yeah.
Right. So we're learning lots of things, but yeah, oh, now I lost my train of thought. Anyway, but yeah, the whole milieu that we found ourselves in, apocalypse. So I thought apocalypse just was kind of like the four horsemen of the apocalypse. You think of war but
Yeah.
it's really just unveiling.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
we are, I told somebody, sing this to the tune of, it's the dawning of the age of Aquarius. This is the dawning of the age of disclosure.
Yeah.
So
That's absolutely
that
right.
is really happening. We are having a disclosure, however that's being brought about. I think I got to say, I think we're in the middle of a bioweapons war. That's what COVID was, and it goes way back in time. And that's what cancer is. I'm going to tell you, I think cancer is a bioweapon. It's a bioweaponized. It's not what people think it is, but it goes way back. But
Yeah.
now we're in an information war, and information wars are tough because you don't know who to believe. And they know that fear and chaos are what have caused them to win for over 5,000
That's
years.
right.
Fear and chaos and confusion. And if you think about it, like the Truman Show is a matrix, it's a false reality. What kept him there? If anybody, I'm sure everybody pretty much has watched it, although I hadn't watched it until this. COVID caused me to watch some things that I thought I needed to see, and that was one of them. So Truman is in this false reality of a reality TV show since the time he's born. He was sold essentially by his mother as a as a person, as a star of the show, and they watched him grow up. He was and the soundstage was an island, so he's on this island for 30 years. And the question is, what kept him there? Why didn't he just drive over the bridge and look back and say, "Oh my gosh, that's just all a soundstage"? That's all it would have taken.
Yep.
But do you remember what kept him there? It was fear of water. They gave him an abnormal fear, an artificial how evil is this?
Yeah.
So they manipulated this little child's psyche so he would be afraid of water, so he would stay in the show, and it would, right. So, and then at the end, the other great line from the show is Ed Harris, when somebody said, I use this when I talk about viruses, it's like, why did we ever believe this stuff? And Ed Harris, when somebody says, why did he believe this? This was a real world. Ed Harris says, well, we tend to believe what we grew up in. This is all the reality he ever knew. And so he believed it. And that's us with a lot of these things. I grew up in the age of viruses. I just believed it. But when you try, and it's so true with so many things, it's not just about viruses. It's true about a lot of things. Like Darwin, I'm telling you, you go try and trace down, and it all sounds good from 30,000 feet, but you get down in the weeds and the nitty gritty, and you try and find the proof of this stuff, and you find it's all smoke and mirrors.
Yep.
It's
That's
really
right.
shocking.
Yeah.
Shocking.
It's completely shocking. Yeah, it's very much like that with faith too. Like as I became, like I said, to me, as I became useful and I started to dig in, what I found was that I had so many, very much to your point, so many preconceived ideas because of what I was taught, right? I didn't know any better of things in the Bible. And so when I really started to get into God's word and actually kind of make the decision that I just wanted to know the truth, right? Because I think what happened through COVID, it was just, there was a fire lit in some of us to really uncover the truth. I want to know the truth. And I started to do that with God's word. And I kind of I hate the term deconstruction because it's just been so horribly mangled these days and really misused, but reconstruct my faith. So I started to get into the Bible and actually see what God's word had to say about things versus what I was taught. And I found that there were so many things that were either completely not in the Bible, completely fabricated, or taken out of context, or twisted to fit a certain narrative, that I just kind of, and I'm still finding things that I was taught that are not correct. And, it was just such a powerful thing because God honored that, through that journey. He really said, for the first time, I literally approached him like a small child, like Jesus tells us to do, right? And just wanted to know who my father was. And he has honored that and continues to honor that more with every single day, every single conversation, every single thing I do. And so it was very much like that with faith too, because once you get the muck wiped off your eyes and you can see things clearly, right? Like we talked about earlier, you see everything. Like maybe not everything, but you see like 50,000 times more little things, bigger things. And it's like, you're looking around and you're like, you still feel kind of like a crazy person. Like, how do you guys not see what's happening? How do you not see these things?
Well, and not even just in that realm, but in just things that we knew about. Like, let's take the thing with Bohemian Grove.
Yeah.
What happened when Alex Jones blew that open on his show? Well, what we should have been asking ourselves is, why are all the major politicians and big industrialists and the military-industrial complex meeting for a week or two in the summer every year at this redwood estate and worship and doing a mock child sacrifice to a huge owl?
Yeah.
That should have been our question, but what
Right.
was it? No, it was they were going after Alex Jones
Yeah.
for being a creep.
Flipping
And
around.
how, you're silly for showing us this. That's just silliness. No, they went there. We know they went there. We have
Yeah.
the proof of that.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that makes you this cognitive dissonance about what they've been trying to show us. And medicine is no different. You know, the guy who is considered the father of modern vaccinology, his name is John F. Enders. When I started looking at him, because he's the one, if it hadn't been for John F. Enders, we wouldn't believe in viruses. Even in my lifetime in medicine, I would graduate in 1980 from medical school when you were born. So that's a little.
No. 2 years after I was born.
Oh, okay, that was a little discerning.
Yeah, but you don't look your age, so you're fine.
Yeah, you're too. Anyway, but when I look back on my old infectious disease text for disease transmission, I wanted to know, what do they think disease transmission is? They did not mention viruses. They were talking about parasites. They were talking about bacteria. They did not mention viruses. That has come about more lately, but way back in 1954, John Enders got a PhD, got a Nobel Prize for being the first guy to quote culture viruses. And again, I went back and read his original papers, which are hard to find. You can't find the original papers. You can find his Nobel laureate speech though, and he extensively quotes them. And you read it and you realize he didn't prove anything. He didn't prove that these are viruses. He didn't prove anything. And so then you wonder, who is this guy? This is my favorite story of falsehood. I mean, this cannot be true. Now, my kids think I'm crazy and I'm just not doing good research, but I think the Nobel Committee should know his history. So he was a rich kid from the East Coast. So he inherits $19 million in 1916, takes himself to Yale. $19 million in the first 2 decades of the 20th century is a lot of money.
Ain't worth $19 million, that's for sure.
Right, $19 million. So he goes to Yale, where he is inducted into the Scroll and Key Society. Now, most people hear about the Skull and Bones, but they've never heard of the Scroll and Key. That's not by accident. The Skull and Bones are for those lesser lights like John Kerry and George Bush, I think. But this is the big one for the big money East Coast science. Dare I say, probably the Illuminati science. But anyway.
By the way, that's roughly $306 million today, just for fun.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, he did inherit a lot.
Yeah. Sorry.
So,
to derail your train.
Yeah, that's interesting. So anyway, but then it says, this is what I got his, I mean, there are other people that talk about this, so this wasn't the only place I got it, but you would think the ultimate source should be the Nobel laureate doesn't give you this and not get the history from you. That's theoretically, you have to confirm your own history.
Yeah.
And they say that in 1916, he started at Yale, but he left in 1917 to go off to World War I and fight, to be a pilot in the Air Force with the rank of ensign. So anybody in the military now is laughing because there was no Air Force in 1918 and there was no ensign in the Air Force ever. That's a naval rank. So what the heck? And people say, well, and so my son, to prove me wrong, because we always these great debates, my younger son is the engineer who says, you've got to be looking at more sources. So he literally contacted the Nobel laureate site. And what they said was, oh, we may have gotten that from a book or something, and that was just in error. No. See, he doesn't understand, I do, about what it is to get that in medicine, and that you're going to be there in person giving a speech, and you're going to approve what's written about you. You can't do that. If that's real, he couldn't have done that. So then the next point is, and it's not just about that. If that were the only thing, I might even say that's possible, but that's not the only thing. Then he leaves Yale. And anybody with a PhD or long time in education knows how bizarre this is. He leaves Yale, and what was his degree in, by the way? Just like Darwin, everybody calls him a naturalist and a botanist. You know what his degree was in? Theology, and he barely got that. Darwin's only experience with rare animals was he founded it with some other guys, the Gluttony Club at Cambridge, and once a week they played cards and ate rare animals. That's his only association.
My goodness.
I'm not kidding you. It's that bizarre. So anyway, so John Enders has a degree in English from Yale. Then he gets out and he sells real estate for a while. And then he said, for some reason, again, there's always the narrative is, and same narrative with Darwin, by the way, that he, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly he fell in love with botany. Well, the story of John Enders was he decides to go back to school. And this time he goes into Harvard, but he's still studying English or literature or something. And then he meets this guy who's a PhD in biology, and he just gets enamored of biology, and whammo, within just a very short period of time, I think he got his Yale degree. He graduated in 1920. And remember, he left in 17 to 18. He couldn't have gotten back in a year or two. I mean,
to go in the Air Force.
Yeah, to go in the Air Force. He only got 2 years of education, probably.
Right.
Yeah, but he got his BA, and now he's at Harvard, and he miraculously gets a PhD in bacteriology and immunology in 1930. Now that's when the BS flag really went up. I really need to make one of those. The guy got a bacteriology and immunology degree. Okay, I was at Rochester, New York as a medical student, and my friend was a MD, PhD candidate, and he was getting his PhD in immunology. It was the first year it was offered because that was a new specialty. So I go to the Harvard area on immunology, and guess what? They didn't give out their first diploma or the first PhD in immunology until 1974. What? And you can't just put that down because it had to go through committee. It had to go through, there's lots of things that have to happen before you can grant a PhD. You can't just decide one day, I'm the chief of biology and I'm going to start a PhD in immunology too. You can't do that. So this whole thing stinks. And I mean, it's just one thing after another. And I'm starting to do that. This is not just it's about a lot of scientists and a lot of it's not just in biology either.
It's not just in science.
And it's not just in science. They're fake people that play a role. It's what Shakespeare said. Makes you think Shakespeare was a time traveler. He said, it's the whole world's a stage, and all the men and women just players
That's right.
strut upon the stage and then are gone. I think we're in something like that because it's just they're putting people up, and like I say, they're always somehow related, and they're related to this bloodline, a lot of them. And so I don't know. It's a very I don't know if you've gotten into symbology, but symbology, one of the reasons to Manly P. Hall once said that when humankind, I think when mankind, I think he says when humans, which I thought was an interesting phrasing. He said, when humans learn to read the language of symbolism, a great veil will fall from their eyes and the truth will be self-evident. And something like, not only that, they will realize the truth has already been out there. It's always been out there. Well, reading symbols is like, why is symbolism so important? Because a single little symbol can transmit a very complex idea, not just in mathematics, but in the world. So I started looking at the fasces, the symbol of fascism, because they all, Antifa, they always want to call everybody a fascist. So what's the story there? Because you see it all over. When Trump gave his speech in the joint Congress and Senate, it was in the Senate Rotunda, or Senate Auditorium, I mean, and here's the dais where he's speaking, and this is every senator that gives a speech on this dais, and on either side, which is now very cleverly camouflaged with some short flags, are these huge fasces that are stuck on the wall, and they've been there for a very long time. So I started really looking into this, and it turns out this is not a modern symbol. It's an ancient symbol. I don't even think some of the historians get this right, because I found evidence of this coming out of ancient Israel, Jehu, Jehu, however you pronounce that. There's a famous obelisk of Shalmaneser III. It's a black stone carved kind of weird kind of monument, but it's in the British Museum, and it shows him bowing down, kowtowing, forehead to the ground, and he's wearing a Phrygian cap, which is a symbol, and then his servants are giving gifts to Shalmaneser III, and the historians at the British Museum said he's giving this, those silver chalices, and bundles of wood, bundles of sticks. Why are you giving silver and then you're giving bundles of sticks? You don't think Shalmaneser, the king of all Persia and all this, could have needed sticks? No, those were fasces. So fasces go way back, but what do they really symbolize? It turns out that they were some kind of weapon, I think. But in any case, like they came out of so I think it came out of probably Babylon or Sumer, but we can't prove that. But certainly ancient Israel had it. It was in Phrygia. And the reason I'm even bringing it up is it's all over. Besides, it's not just Mussolini. It was all over. And it turns out that in 1913, when we stood up the Fed, right, to finalize the takeover of America, we had to have the Federal Reserve. One of the ancient cities of Phrygia, the cardinal city of ancient Phrygia, was Philadelphia. So Philadelphia is not named for Philadelphia because it's a city of brotherly love. It's named as an homage to the ancient Phrygian city, and it's got a mint. And so when they did the Federal Reserve, they minted a new dime called the Mercury dime. And it's really symbolically super interesting. But I realized as a kid, they still had silver coins out there. I carried Mercury dimes in my pocket. So what's on the front? Well, we knew it was Mercury dime because it's winged Mercury. It's supposed to be the messenger of the gods. But what's he wearing? He's wearing a Phrygian cap. He's the messenger from Phrygia to America. Okay. And then you turn it on the backside, and what is it? It's the fasces, the symbol of totalitarianism. It always was back then too. It was a symbol of power. If you were the emperor, you could have 24 lictors that carried the fasces. But if you were just a lower level notary or something, you might only have one or two, and people in between. So it was a symbol of power, and it always has been. But it's totalitarian power. It's not American constitutional might. Okay. So here, think about how creepy that is. In World War II, we're sending our sons and daughters over to Europe to fight the war against two fascist nations. And yet Americans are running around here jingling coins with the fasces on as their main symbol.
It's crazy.
See, they're laughing at us.
Yeah.
And this is, George Washington was made into a monument. One of his statuary. He's got his arm, he's got a draped shawl, and his arm is resting on a fascist. Lincoln, in the Lincoln Memorial, when his hands are up there, look at what he's on, fasces. They're on the state capitol. I mean, not the federal capitol. They're all over our symbolism.
I wonder if there's any in the rotunda painting with Washington. Was it apotheosis of George Washington? That's weird too.
I think I looked at that, and I don't think they were on the apotheosis, but the 9 states have the Phrygian cap, including the state of Iowa, by the way. I don't know why those 9. They don't have anything in common. Some are the original 13. Some are like Hawaii is one. We're one. Those are 3 different categories of states, and I don't know, but I think the Phrygian cap, we've been told the Phrygian cap is a symbol of freedom, like they used it in the French Revolution. Well, the French Revolution was evil. That was brought on by Weishaupt and the Illuminati. And the Phrygian cap was in Phrygia. It was a symbol of being freed of chains. So yeah, you were out of chains, but now you're a debt slave, because Phrygia developed banking, corporations, minted gold for the first time. Who was the first king of Phrygia that we learn about in grade school? King Midas, the king that could turn the river to gold.
Yeah.
Who was the last known Phrygian emperor? Croesus, King Croesus, who was he was the richest, as rich as Croesus. That's also a phrase. So these were filthy rich people that were equestrian elite, that had nothing to do, and this is according to Herodotus, with the people that they ruled. They would move from country to country. According to Herodotus, they'd move from country to country, and they would stay within their own bloodline, and they would rule people that were not of themselves. What's that sound like? Sounds like the world today.
It does. One of the things I was thinking of as you were saying that, and just having all the conversations that I've had with people over the years now, I almost wonder if it's kind of a territory marking. Like a territory marking. Like your flags and stuff, having these symbols is like a marking of that territory, like the enemy claiming that territory. Because clearly,
I think so. See, that's my point about it. Happened in 1913. They commissioned this dime. So what happened is basically, I think, and the point is, what is the fasces? If the fasces were carried by lictors, They were never carried by the emperor or the people they were guarding. So the real people in power never carried the fasces, and the fasces were carried by people. The reason they set up corporations in Phrygia, by the way, was to pay their private military contractors. They were the lictors. So let's see what that means. To me, it means we probably are the lictor country for whoever's really in charge in the world. Because we are, people talk about the Crown Corporation. The money's in England. The Vatican is the head of the philosophy, the thing, and then we are the military arm. Well, that goes along with that. We are the lictor country.
It's crazy, man. You can't make this stuff up, and it's
No, you can't.
the more you find, the more you dig further and you find more. You dig further and you find more, because really, it's like we're trying to reverse engineer thousands of years of spiritual war in history.
Yeah.
And the two are constantly. I mean, they're lockstep, right? Like you can't separate one from the other. It's just not possible. And it's just fascinating. Well, I had about 15 other things that I wanted to get to with you, but we had a wonderful conversation. I guess we're gonna have to talk again.
Yeah,
Darn.
there you go.
So,
Yeah,
but
I'm sorry, I probably drifted off there, but
no.
I just think it's important for people to understand that there's when you see people doing the one eye photographs, they always do. It's not by accident.
No.
And people think, oh, it's kind of silly to look at that. It's important because they're conveying a message. And when we really understand their messages, they're like cockroaches in a light. They're going to flee.
Yeah. No, absolutely. There is dark demonic control over that industry. Without a doubt. Without a doubt. I am not, I said this, I think, on another show recently, but I am not super spiritually attuned to like the darkness radar. I really don't have a really good, strong spiritual attunement for that. And I'm probably getting stronger as my faith grows, but my wife is. But I will tell you this.
Maybe it's a women thing, because the women are the head witches in that darkness.
It makes a lot of sense, right?
I'm attuned to it too, I think.
Yeah, she is. And discernment too. Like she's attuned to that, and she has very strong discernment as far as people and just environments, and just she's got a good radar, which is a great compliment to me because I don't have that. So hopefully I compliment her back, but probably not. She's definitely my better 2/3. But we went out took a trip out to California, and we went to Venice Beach. And man, you want to talk about palpable evil?
Which beach?
Venice Beach. Yeah, they have all these shops and stuff set up down the boardwalk, right? And it was just like, even for me, which I'm not spiritually attuned, right? Like it's not my big thing. Even for me, I was like, you can feel the evil here. Like it is palpable in the air. And I remember we walked past this one shop, and I turned, and my wife stopped, and she kind of turned and she looked in there, and I said, do you want to go in there? And she said, no. Matter of fact, I want to get as far away from this place as humanly possible. So whatever was going on in there was uber bad. And considering the vibe that was already in the air, it must have,
it was bad.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because I'm not. But it makes sense. Like when you drive around out there, the place has just been completely taken over by drugs. And I mean, it's literally like Satan's little playhouse. It's really sad. And not all California, but certain LA.
Oh, yeah. I was in Winnipeg, and I was going to, we were walking down the street, and it was after giving a speech somewhere in a different city. But anyway, we were in Winnipeg for another reason, and we're walking down the street, and I noticed this building. It's not a hotel, but it looks like it has an H on it. Well, I knew what those were. Those were old Babylonian symbols on the windows.
Yeah.
And it's the thing that caught my eye that caused me to look at the window was the statue in the front. And it's just this creepy statue. I mean, I'm with your wife, when it's just, it just creeps you out. It's not right. It wasn't the Baphomet, but it was kind of a modern, weird version, I think. So
I'm telling you, it's very prevalent. And again, the more you see, the more you see. It's kind of a cliche thing, but it's very true. Well, Lee, thanks so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, it's been great having you. Sorry we had some tech difficulties to get started.
Yeah,
but,
I'm sorry that was on my end, but
no, it's okay.
Now I'm going to have to de-Google myself.
I know. We should all de-Google ourselves, trust me, because the more I use it, the more I want to throw like everything out the window. It's horrible. So
yeah,
for sure, for certain. Well, everybody, if you guys have enjoyed this discussion again, please just make sure that you like, subscribe, share, and then give me a 5-star review if you think I'm worthy of it on all of the different listening platforms. But if you'd like to be a member of the show too, you can head over to the membership website, thewordAtwar.supercast.com, and sign up to have your membership today. And then if you enjoyed this conversation, check out the episode Transhumanism with my friend Dr. Joy Pugh that I referenced earlier. Until next time, stay vigilant, warriors.